The oily dollar is a subject that affects our nation's military strategy and our foreign policy, because a great deal of military force is required to support our reliance on fossil fuel and the entangling alliances that prop it up. The 2002 protesters against the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq were clear about this when they shouted, "How did our oil get underneath their sand?" Our speakers will address the history of the oily dollar, as well as how it affects our economy, energy policy, and militarism in the United States.
It's my pleasure to introduce Ricky Gard-Diamond. She's a valued member of our WILPF Women, Money, and Democracy Committee. The feminist economist, is author of several fiction books and the feminist economic masterwork, Screwnomics: How Our Economy Works Against Women and Real Ways to Make Lasting Change. Ricky is also founder of the WILPF US Partner Organization, An Economy of Our Own. She's here to talk about how the oily dollar defines the US economy and how it limits us in our path towards a sustainable future, and some of the history involved with all of that. Ricky, welcome. Unmute yourself and tell us about the economic implications of the oily dollar.
I have to do one disclaimer. I was introduced as an economist, and I have to tell you that I am not an economist. I don't even play one on TV. So I am, what I'm proud to say, is an amateur economist. I began the hard way learning by being a single mom on welfare, and educated myself over the years, just pursuing the language of economics, which I think is really key to understanding a good deal of confusion that most people have about the economy. And women in particular, I think, are a bit intimidated about it, and also consider, this audience is probably not the case, but I think more widely this is true for a lot of women. And anyway, women have plenty to do already, right, without having to take on economic details too. But I do think it's important, and so we're getting women together at An Economy of Our Own to talk about issues in the same way that you're doing here with your WILPF calls. Just trying to educate ourselves and sharing what we know. So could we start the slideshow? Okay, I thought it would be a good idea because I know that there's a WILPF book group that's reading Ellen Brown's wonderful book on money, Web of Debt, right now. And that's this famous story. Web of Debt is based on the famous story that you all know, the Dorothy in the Land of Oz, and walking that yellow brick road. It was published in 1900, which I thought was a good place to start because the American public back then was more deeply informed about currency issues than is true today. Many were challenging the bankers' gold standard, those yellow bricks that made money scarcer as the population grew. William Jennings Bryan, running for president, had given a famous speech saying, "You shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold." He'd wanted more silverback currency, but lost the election in 1896. Next. Yes, because muckrakers were on the bankers' case, calling out the Gilded Age, in 1910, a secret meeting of very powerful bankers and one very friendly senator was convened by Wall Street's J.P. Morgan and crafted together a plan on Jekyll Island where all the richest Americans vacationed, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the Pulitzers. They all knew each other. And they came up with this plan and sent their friendly senator to D.C. to sell the Federal Reserve law, which was signed, as you can see in the newspaper there, by President Wilson in 1913 to, as he says, to aid business. And that's the truth. Signed in, it required that the Federal Reserve hold gold equal to 40% of the value of the currency it issued, baking in the banker's gold standard. Technically, Federal Reserve notes are what we call dollars, could be, in those days, converted to gold at a fixed price of $20.67, which is a number I hope you keep in your head because it's important. The Fed controlled gold's flow with interest rates. Higher rates encouraged Americans to put their gold coins in bank deposits, while lower interest rates encouraged businesses to take out bank loans. Next slide. This pic includes a rare woman. There weren't many in these circles. This is Frances Perkins, Secretary of Labor. A lot of you probably recognize her. And it also leaves out a lot, like World War I, which we won, and the Great Crash that happened in 1929. But for our purposes, what's important is that in the time between 1929 and this March 1933 executive order, the Fed paper dollar, their notes in circulation had more than doubled. And that worried Americans. So they began to cash out their deposits at the bank, creating a bank run so serious that FDR had to declare a bank holiday and close everybody's doors. So after he'd met with everyone and figured things out, he made this executive order. And he said all U.S. citizens had to turn in their gold coins and their bullion to the Federal Reserve in exchange for $20.67 an ounce. The Gold Reserve Act that was put into place just a year later, after he thought some more, I guess, went even further and required the Federal Reserve to surrender all its gold to the U.S. Treasury. But here was FDR's sleight of hand. His new law also upped the value of gold to $35 an ounce, not the $20.67. So it was quite a big boost. Now, this is going to be counterintuitive, and we're going to talk about this more in a minute, but raising the price of gold devalued the Fed's paper dollar, thus raising all the prices back to the rates they'd been in 1926, boosting the economy, which is good for the business, and really saved the business ownership class from its own greed. But it didn't help the folks in the Grapes of Wrath very much. Next slide. I'm just going to briefly note, this is 1944, Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, where after World War II was won, 44 allied nations got together to talk about trade policy. And I'm going to point out the two women that are visible here. They're sitting in the middle with a Boy Scout, and they don't have plaques, so I don't think they were in the decision-making mode, which is generally true for all kinds of currency decisions. It was very much a male world. So this meeting created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank for World Trade, and negotiations favored the U.S. because after we won World War II by supplying the world with all kinds of weapons, we held most of the world's gold. Our allies in London were still using sterling, but they lost out to the U.S. in a compromise at Bretton Woods where currency exchange rates were decided. And for everyone's stability, they fixed the exchange rate pegged to the U.S. dollar, which itself was pegged to that $35 an ounce price for gold. This came with the usual built-in problems of gold. By 1960, economist Robert Triffin was going to be predicting that gold production couldn't keep pace with financing growing global trade. So the Federal Reserve loan-based dollar outflows resulted in a balance of payments deficit, a trade imbalance. Trillin warned that growing U.S. dollar liabilities, our debt, our growing debt, and our trade deficit would erode trust, and nations would cash in their dollars for gold in another classic bank run, only worldwide. 2008 showed us what that's like, and we want to try to avoid that. Next slide. So luckily, or maybe unluckily, FDR was developing something new that would counter this. And Charlotte is going to be talking about this much more and clear up any kind of confusion that I may be sowing here. She's really the expert on this. A 1945 meeting between FDR and the Saudi Ibn Said cut a deal. In return for U.S. military and business training, the king allowed a new U.S.-built airfield and access to their oil fields for American dollars. This close U.S.-Saudi relationship has survived years of differences over the Arab-Israeli conflict and is at the heart of the U.S. international dollar dominance, really. But here is where Alice in Wonderland comes in, and she's a little bit like Dorothy in the Land of Oz, you know. The chart I want to point out that has that red line, it vividly shows that loss of purchasing power of our U.S. paper dollar. You see that at the same time, our international dominance was growing. So if you look at the top here, we're starting with the Federal Reserve's founding in 1913, and you can see that big drop in the red line. That's 1929's crash. And then you can see it starting to go back up, and that little circle there is for what FDR did with the gold law that he put in place, devaluing the dollar, and you can see it's just kind of going down and down and down. So this has been a steady trend since 1913 right up to the present day. We're going to talk about the other little circle there, the one in the middle, in the next slide. You really have to be tricky like Dick Nixon to understand how this stuff works. How did devaluing the dollar help U.S. businesses? Well, U.S. export values decrease, making them more globally competitive. Trade deficits are then settled with less valuable dollars, their inflated dollars. We've heard about China's manipulation of currency in its trade deals, but we don't hear much about our own trade deals. But that red line that you saw on the previous chart is really a long-term relationship with the Federal Reserve dollar. It's counterintuitive, but it's real. So just as Triffin had predicted, France began a bank run, beginning to cash in their dollars for gold, suspecting the U.S. wouldn't be able to sustain its huge military spending in Vietnam because they had experience, I guess. And by then, gold was valued at $40.80. So he was in trouble, and he decided, he did other things, but he decided one thing he would do is end Bretton Woods Agreement. No more dollars were going to be exchanged for gold. So the Fed's currency was going to float. But other countries are still pegged to our currency. So why? That doesn't make much sense. Why is there a missing graph here? Where Nixon's picture is, below that, I have a colored illustration of how it works. And then basically, it's OPEC. It's the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, one of which is the Saudis. And they will sell their oil only for dollars. And that means that people have to have, like the picture I had was a picture of Australia, which was making a deal with OPEC to buy oil. But to buy that oil, they had to have dollars to pay OPEC and Saudis and the people who were members of that organization that was required to get oil. So as a result, currency manipulation is our free market at its most ruthless work. In practice, the devaluation of the US dollar has allowed us to bully less powerful countries, which is also counterintuitive, right? How does that happen? Despite the shrinking value, your money's inflation, foreign nations' central banks have to stock up on US dollars for their reserves so they can buy oil. It's another of those economan secrets hidden right under our noses. Even if you heard of the oily dollar, which I'm sure everyone here has, you'd be unlikely to understand the details of its importance. So next slide. That'll show us. Yeah, there we are. This is Forex trading, swaps and derivatives. We're not going to talk about swaps and derivatives, although I do in Screwnomics, because that would take more time. But when Bretton Woods created our global money system, currency trading or foreign exchange was a small part of business. But as the U.S. petrodollar became the reserve currency around the world and became more plentiful as more people bought more oil with more and more dollars, currency trading grew more important, going public finally in 1996. Now, this is the really important part for WILPF women to understand. Central banks have few places to invest U.S. dollars. They can't buy, with their surplus dollars, they can't buy U.S. corporate stocks, for instance. So nations recycle their extra U.S. dollars by purchasing U.S. Treasury notes. They're financing our U.S. debt, which is mostly military debt from all of our wars and 800 bases around the world. The U.S. is waging daily financial war backed up by encircling threats of real violence by a military free of charge to the U.S. If that sounds crazy, remember Saddam Hussein had begun selling oil in euros, not dollars. You know what happened to him in Iraq. Gaddafi was organizing a new gold-based currency when he was overthrown, and a new obedient Libyan central bank was installed with the help of the New York Fed. Now China, Russia, and Iran are working to replace the dollar, tired of paying what is essentially tribute to the U.S. to their own disadvantage. So you can kind of understand that. And of course, our oily dollar also explains a very stubborn U.S. policy of climate crisis denial. Next slide. So I once had dinner with a currency trader, and he told me how they start each day. You see those little squiggly lines on that middle screen there. He said each day they find the ceiling and the base. You can see those lines there. And then they trade within the margin set, he said, by men that traders themselves refer to as the big bastards. Some say our dollar is too big to fail, but haven't we heard that before? About 200,000 young guys under 40 trade currencies worldwide around the clock to the tune of $6.6 trillion a day. Most Americans don't even know about foreign exchange or Forex, the biggest market in the world. That's because currency trading is mostly used by international and central banks, multinational corporations, and hedge funds. They're all macro players using algorithms and software called quants for high-frequency trading. Hedge funds are credited with creating growing numbers of U.S. billionaires. And as I write in Screwnomics, most often hedge funds work by leveraging investors' money, using it to borrow like mad. Unlike the bond and stock markets, hedge funds are a free market dream, all but unregulated. Sometimes called vultures for the way they prey on the weak, hedgers manipulate currency values. International currency is now traded as if it were itself a commodity. Today, that commodity isn't gold, it isn't oil, it isn't even paper. It's a blip on a computer screen. Next slide. So these numbers are outgrowing Earth. This monetary system isn't related to earthly limits or the lives of the majority of people on the planet, which are also limited, right? We need to tax the gambling, stop inflating asset prices with bogus numbers, and reform our currency by basing it in human caring, and environmental value not, debt, and greed. And that's it for me here.
Laura has entered a couple of questions here. She's asking, is a single world currency a solution that is to ending the U.S. imperialist currency?
Good question. A lot of people are talking about that. And actually, there was originally at the Bretton Woods conference a proposal for such a currency for world trade, at least. It was called Bancor. That was an English proposal. But more often, I think people are talking about the dangers of monocropping with one currency for all. You know, that by definition is kind of imperialistic. And so a lot of people are talking about more currencies, complementary currencies, additional ways to fund different parts of the economy, a food currency, for instance, or a water currency, an environmental currency, a caring currency, which is something I propose in Screwnomics. So I think more would actually be more helpful, but I think it's going to be a while before we figure it all out.
Okay, Lenny has a question. How can we stop the U.S. from waging financial warfare on other countries, which the U.S. does by using the SWIFT system and the fact that international exchange is carried out in dollars?
I don't know that I know that much about their domination of that SWIFT channel. I think we need to recognize that we not only subject other countries to this kind of domination, we subject our own citizens to this kind of domination. There is a very, those 200,000 young men who are trading those currencies are working for a very small number of really big players, the big just to quote them. Now, I don't mean to offend anyone, the big bastards that the traders talk about who are really making those decisions. So it's, I can't say that I know the solution to that.
Well, a lot of people are giving you shout outs, Ricky, and saying they want to be sure that this is being recorded and where can they access it. And in the chat, both Mary Beth and Darian have posted the link to the WILPF US YouTube channel. So that is where it can be found in the future. Cheryl Spencer had a clarification question. Is it 200,000 or 2,000 traders?
I believe it's 200,000. It's from Occupy Money, which was written by Marguerite Kennedy, but we could fact check that. I can look again.
All right, folks, you have one last chance for a question.
This is a global trading, global trading 24 hours a day. So I'm thinking it's probably the bigger number.
Okay, I think it's a good time to transition to our next speaker. There may be time for more questions for Ricky later, but I think that's about all the time we have. So thank you for those good questions and good discussion there.
Thank you very much, Ricky. That was great. And yeah, really good questions too. I agree. So Barbara Taft, co-chair of the Middle East Peace and Justice Action Committee, is here to introduce the work of her committee and to introduce our second speaker. Barbara, thanks for suggesting this speaker and for introducing her.
Thank you. Charlotte Dennett is a former Middle East reporter. She's an investigative journalist, and she's an attorney. She has written a lot of books, some of which you've probably heard about, but she has just recently published a book called The Crash of Flight 3804, and it's subtitled A Lost Spy, A Daughter's Quest, and the Deadly Politics of the Great Game for Oil. In 1947, her father was on that flight, and the relationship between what happened to him when his plane crashed and why it happened is something that she's going to explain in her talk. I'm not going to tell you a lot of details because I know that's what she's here for. So I want you to all welcome Charlotte Bennett. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Barbara. Okay, so I have a little a show for you. I'm always nervous something's going to go wrong, but here we go. First, I'm going to share my screen. So that's my book, and as Barbara explained, is about a plane crash. There, I got this out of the archives. I got the whole accident report. They killed my father and 6 other Americans on board. My father was America's sole master spy in the Middle East at this time. He was with the Office of Strategic Services, later became the Central Intelligence Group, and then ultimately the CIA. But he died before the CIA was created. At any rate, his plane never made it to Ethiopia. I never knew him, by the way. He died when I was 6 weeks old, but then I got interested. So I as a journalist, I began to wonder what happened to him, because I was retracing many of his steps when I was based in Beirut as a journalist. So this is the New York Times, and it came out just 2 weeks before the crash. And lo and behold, there's this article about a new pipeline. And what struck me is that my father's job as an OSS spy was to figure out what the route of the pipeline was going to be. And he made a top secret visit to Saudi Arabia. And this map actually shows the route of the pipeline. That is the projected route. And as you can see, it crosses Jordan, Iraq, it crosses Syria. It eventually lands in Lebanon, but at the time there was a question of whether it was going to terminate in Lebanon or Palestine, which I thought was very interesting. But look at this, what it says. Protection of the pipeline will become a prime objective of American foreign policy. And that means military protection. So right now you're seeing, just as the United States is pulling out of the war, it wants to protect that pipeline. And the reason it wants to is because the oil of Saudi Arabia is a huge prize, and it actually allows the United States to use it as collateral and also to prop up the Marshall Plan in Europe. So that's another reason why protection of the pipeline was so important, not only to my father, but to the US government. Here's just me showing you some of the documents that were turned over because I sued the CIA for more information. And I got this one great document that had not been redacted. And here was this one sentence that projected what my father's job was going to be when he went over to Lebanon. We must control the oil of Saudi Arabia at all costs. And what I learned is he was battling not the Germans, because they had already been defeated. He was battling our former allies, the British, the French, and the Russians. They all wanted the Saudi oil, and they were deeply resentful over the fact that the U.S. had a unique concession, an exclusive concession. Okay, so that's when I just started to discover what I call the great game for oil. It's still going on. And since we have limited time, I'm just going to show you some maps of what I discovered. This one, this gives you an introduction. When I went to Lebanon, this was I was there in the early 60s as a high school student, and later in the early 70s as a journalist. We were always told that Lebanon was the gateway to the Middle East. But the more I studied, I realized that oil people and great powers look at it differently. They see it as the gateway to Middle East oil. And when you draw this this rectangle over the region, you can understand why. Because all of them were thinking of sending their oil to the Eastern Mediterranean. Look at the countries: Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia. They all had to ship their oil out, and one of the key ways was on the Mediterranean coast. Now I'm going to fast forward to the period after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. At the time, there was a huge rush for Caspian Sea oil because all the countries surrounding the Caspian used to be controlled by Russia. Now they were going independent. That was one big factor I understood. But also, when it comes to post 9/11, that's when the great game goes on steroids. And I found this article by Frank Viviano, which was published by New York Times, very rare, just in early October after September 11th. And what does he say? After the September 11th attacks, he writes, what you're going to find is that all the areas where they are fighting terrorists happen to correspond to where they're looking at oil. The map of terrorist sanctions and targets in the Middle East and Central Asia, to an extraordinary degree, is a map of the world's primary energy sources in the 21st century. The defense of these resources, rather than the simple confrontation between Islam and the West, will be the primary flashpoint of global conflict for decades to come. And so he was one of the few writers that understood this this great rush for oil in the post 9/11 period. And by the way, the plotting for the oil of Iraq and Afghanistan long preceded 9/11. And Dick Cheney was one of the main people that was scouting around looking for oil in the Caspian. So I'm going to jump ahead now. And one of the first enterprises that they thought they were going to pull off was the creation of this pipeline. It's called PAPI, based on the countries that are going to traverse. And you can see what they are. The Caspian Sea is up there in the left corner, but some of the oil and gas, it can be found in Turkmenistan as well. So the whole idea was to construct this pipeline, and initially the Taliban were going to protect it. That was the idea, because they were the fiercest warriors in Afghanistan. But then relations ran afoul right before 9/11. So instead, the U.S. sent its troops to fight the Taliban, and they were victorious. And then what happens? You see those little balloons? Those are all foreign military outposts that are set up along the route of the projected pipeline. And down in one area right here is where the Canadian troops were supposed to protect the pipeline. And I've got a great quote from a Canadian about it, but guess what? It's not there. So we will move on. But anyway, what he was saying is that the purpose for the invasion, U.S. invasion, was to allow energy to flow south. So who had ever heard of that? You know, it's all hidden. It's all hidden from the public. So then I began to look at the war in Iraq in 2003. And lo and behold, I discovered that Netanyahu envisioned that a pipeline that carried oil from Iraq to Haifa was going to be reopened. This pipeline was built in the 30s and by the Iraq Petroleum Company, and the southern branch was controlled by the British. And the British mandate, the southern was controlled by the French. So we fast forward up to 2003. This pipeline had been closed during the War of Independence in 1948, and Netanyahu wanted it reopened. And the scheme was that they were going to put an Iraqi living in exile named Ahmed Chalabi, who was very pro-Israel. He was going to take over after Saddam Hussein was overthrown. And the only reason he didn't is it became public that he was the author of the idea of weapons of mass destruction, which had been totally discredited. So that plan didn't work. And as for Netanyahu saying that the resurrection of this pipeline is not a pipe dream, well, it is. It still has not been constructed because of all the conflict. And this is another thing to take into consideration. If you can't control the pipeline that you plan to build or reopen, you will not get financial backing. And so there's another example of how money and pipeline politics intersect. And that's why there's always this concern about security. If they only could get security. With the question of Afghanistan, I really wonder if all the troops are going to be withdrawn, because otherwise they're not going to be able to protect that PAPI pipeline. I think they're going to keep a small number there to continue. Okay. So then we move on. Okay. Now consider all the problems in Gaza and Israel. It turns out that there have been huge oil and gas finds off the coast of the Eastern Mediterranean, and they're shown here in this map. So Gaza actually has claimed interest in this little narrow sliver here in some of the oil and gas, and had hoped that this would be a great boon to their economy. But what happened is Netanyahu and Israeli generals did not want the Palestinians to get the income from this oil. And there's some really outrageous quotes from them saying, boy, if they get $1 billion worth of revenue, it's not going to go to helping the Palestinian people. It's going to go into feeding terrorism. So we can't allow it to happen. So one of the things that I was able to do in my book was to document how two vicious assaults on Gaza, one in 2007, and another in 2014, was the result of largely the result of wanting to keep the oil and gas away out of the hands of the Gazans. And I can't help but think that that is another reason for the current hostilities. Barbara, thank you. I didn't know they'd been going on for 3 months, which therefore makes me think all the more that this is part of Netanyahu's big plan to prevent the oil and gas from getting into the hands of the Palestinians. Mind you, there is now prospecting in the West Bank, which is why they wanted to annex it. And another scheme that Israel has had all along has been to serve as an energy corridor along the Eastern Mediterranean. And when you look at the Eastern Mediterranean, you suddenly begin to see that there are certain countries that stand in the way of Israel constructing this vast pipeline scheme that's going to take the oil and gas up to Europe. And those countries are Lebanon and Syria. And as we all know, Lebanon has been totally crushed recently, and Syria is in very desperate situation. Of course, we know that the U.S. is supporting the Kurds in eastern Syria, where there is oil right over in this area. That's where the fighting is. It's the one area where Syria has oil, and the U.S. has the temerity of occupying that and declaring it our own, violating the sovereignty of the Syrians. But I heard a speech recently by Josh Landis that said, oh my God, their economy is being destroyed. So is this a big plot? Can't prove it. Just saying that they're in dire situations. And I just heard that Lebanon is going to be constructing the largest U.S. embassy in the whole Middle East, in poor Lebanon. Well, what's that all about? I had heard that they wanted to build a base there at the time of Prime Minister Hariri, who ended up being assassinated because he did not want a U.S. military base. So now they're trying, when Lebanon is flattened, to build this huge American embassy. I don't know what happened to the embassy in Iraq. Now I'm almost done, folks, and then you can ask me questions. Finally, look at Syria. I started to look at the war in Syria and was able to put together that efforts to undermine the regime of Assad really took off in 2010. First of all, a pipeline scheme had been offered by Qatar, and it's this lower one. And it's the idea, Qatar is very, very rich, and it has some of the richest natural gas reserves in the world, shared, by the way, with Iran on the other side of the Gulf. But anyway, this pipeline was going to go through Syria and then up through Turkey. Well, Assad rejected it. He didn't want it. He didn't want it coming from there. And he proposed an alternative, which was to take the natural gas of Iran and have it run through Syria and on to Europe. So there are some of us who believe that the civil war, so-called, in Syria was really a pipeline war. And it remains to be seen whether these pipelines are ever going to be built. And just by the way, you can see up here the Black Sea. Okay, that's a whole nother story. I won't get into it, but it involves Ukraine and Russian efforts to try to control sending its oil and gas through pipelines through the Black Sea. I mean, once you develop pipeline consciousness, as one of the readers of my book said, in fact, it was Naomi Wolf, once you see this map, you can't unsee them, and it starts to make sense. Finally, Yemen, same situation. I found out that there was a plan for a pipeline that was going to run from the Saudi oil fields in Ras Tanura and go right through Yemen without getting any permission from the Yemen people. The idea of constructing this pipeline was because there was concern that Iran was going to block the passage of tankers through the Strait of Hormuz. So this was another way of shipping Saudi oil. It was going to go through southern Yemen and down through this port. I found out that, guess who protected the pipeline route right there? Al-Qaeda. Can you believe it? This is another thing I found out. The U.S. uses terrorists to be able to come in and fight. They use terrorists as a pretext for sending in military to protect their oil routes and their oil supplies. So in this case, there's Al-Qaeda. The other concern was another choke point right here in the Red Sea where tankers have to pass. And as you know, there's been fighting in there. The Houthi in the north, they are an indigenous people, and they've been fighting the corrupt Western influence, and were able to take over Sana'a, and this is the whole oil region. Well, that freaked out Saudi Arabia and the U.S., and so they by 2015 they were building up military supplies, and the war against Yemen has started. So there is an oil component to that as well. That was a warning my father gave in 1943. He said that because he had been in Lebanon in the 1930s and began to understand the great game for oil and how destructive it was going to be. So I'm going to end it there, and people can ask me questions.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Wow, that is fascinating. Your book sounds like a real page turner, and your presentation did evoke some questions in the chat. So I'm going to ask Mary Beth, would you read out those questions for us?
Terry Gates wanted to know what, if any, is the effect of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative in the pipeline wars? Are they in the mix now?
Yeah, Good question. Yes, they are. And why is it that the United States it seems so threatened by China? Because the Chinese have big plans, and they're moving into the Middle East, and they're also moving into Africa, East Africa, by the way. Yeah, it's pipeline politics on steroids. That's what's going on right now. And of course, then there's the whole turning the Russians into the great evildoers, and that's about the Nord Stream pipeline, which Russia has planned to send natural gas to Germany, and the U.S. has been fighting it tooth and nail. That's why they're sanctioning Russia and sanctioning some of the countries that were building the pipeline. But it looks like Germany is going to prevail, and so is Russia, and it's going to go through. But these pipeline wars, I'll tell you, they get very vicious, and it's not just about getting profits. It's all about the whole mix of empire building. You know, the petrodollar, the control over these countries economically, using oil, controlling oil. The reason why the control of oil is so important is for two reasons. One is oil remains the fuel of the military, and the Germans ran out of gas in 2 world wars, so they learned real quickly that you can't run out of oil. And the other one is to, you know, prop up the petrodollar system as long as you can have control over the oil routes.
And Henny asked, if we decarbonize the world economy to save the climate and life support systems on Earth, will it remove much of the reason for the conflict in the Middle East?
Yeah, I believe it will. But it's going to take a long time, I think, because I mean, it's really sad to see that on the one hand, you've got, you know, some of the major oil companies are investing heavily in alternatives. In Texas, of all places, you know, Exxon, Mobil, for instance, they're all doing it. They see the writing on the wall, not just because of climate change, but they suffered mightily during the pandemic, and that forced the big ones to look at alternatives even with greater vigor. At the same time, the great game is still going on in the Eastern Mediterranean, big time. You got the Turks versus the Greeks and the Cypriots and the Egyptians, and now there's oil that's been discovered in the Mediterranean. And so that all involves North Africa and East Africa. Now I'm finding out that in West Africa, they're all exploring for oil. It's big power, inter-imperial rivalry, if you like. The big powers, they're all competing against each other because they want to control the oil. So it's going to take a while.
Charlotte, could you turn your camera back on now that you don't have the screen share? Then we can see you.
Yeah.
Okay, there's just one more question. I hope you can answer it quickly because we're running out of time. Several nations in the Middle East, Barbara Taft asks, are trying to go into eco-friendly energy, but retooling for this will take time, and we don't know how many people will die in the time it takes. How can we diffuse the violence to save lives? An easy question, right?
Well, sure, it's a big one. One of the things I've been arguing for as part of our strategic planning is if we can educate the public more about the deleterious effects of oil in war, the connection between oil and war. We have the possibility to connect with veterans groups and with anti-pipeline groups in the U.S. And it's going to take a lot of public pressure. I feel that shining the light, exposing these oil companies and governments for propping up these horrific, I mean, truly, if you think of the millions of people have died since World War II because of these oil wars, you know, maybe it would make a difference along with the wonderful climate activists. So I think we need to work with everyone that is pursuing eco-friendly energy, at the same time exposing how the energy companies have been behind endless wars. Because most people don't know it. It doesn't get reported in the press. It just doesn't get reported. Just like the imbalance on Palestine and Gaza.
Thanks so much, Charlotte. I'm sorry we've run out of time, but if people have more questions and want to put them in the chat, we'll try and ask Ricky and Charlotte to answer them in an email follow-up. It's the best we can do.
That's great.
Thank
So
you.
it's goodbye, everybody, right?
Bye-bye. Thank you.
You can hang in there, Charlotte.
Well, that's all right.